As I say, we're going through the biggest transformations in history since the Industrial Revolution, really. And that's what the big boys said themselves many years ago in their talks, their big meetings on their plans for the world. These are the greatest changes we've seen in an awful long time. It's not just cultural changes, but they also mentioned that vast movements of people would go across the world from one country to the next and so on. Well, we've seen that over the last 10 years or more, in fact. And yet they made these speeches over 30 years ago, sometimes 40 years ago, at the global meetings they were having, when they predicted they would bring the world to the state that it's in now. And of course, through financial collapse and so on, economic crisis, they would bring the world under the World Bank and the IMF, and that's what we're living through as well. Never mind all the cultural changes which they said they'd bring in, which we've seen happen. We're living through a script. A script, though, that's incredibly well organized. And it's not difficult when you realize that the richest people on the planet, who run the whole money system for the whole planet, basically run all the front organizations and the think tanks and all the NGO groups and charities that lobby and promote the various causes, that all work together along separate roads to bring themselves onto the same road at the end, which is a form of scientific socialism for the entire planet. But of course run by the big boys at the top, who've always been there. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back and we're cutting through the matrix. As I say, we're living through a script, and you have to delve into your histories to fit the puzzles together, because there's like lots of puzzles within puzzles, and it's only here and there you get little scattered pieces of information. Sometimes just one paragraph in some thick, dry, old, dusty book, and you put that together with other dry paragraphs or liners, one-liners, and comments or statements by authors and big movers. And you start to see that you truly are living in a script. These guys don't sit at the top saying, well, we govern the peoples. They sit at the top and they plan a particular type of future. And it's no secret really, once you get into them, that you find the problem has always been not just how to get power or maintain power. It's how to keep power over the general public. And you do get the sense, because these guys at the top do go over their histories, and they look carefully at rebellions and revolutions down through the ages, and they don't want them to have to be repeated on themselves, where they're ousted, especially when they have an agenda at stake. And their whole idea, in all sides, in all parts, it doesn't matter if it was communist or capitalist or whatever, they were into the same thing, sharing the wisdom between scientists with their international science meetings on how to use science to make the people more docile and compliant and more content with whatever lot they were handed by the big boys at the top, and whatever kind of system they were given to live in as well. And they talked about using incredible psychologies, which are there all the time. You can't pick up any media today where psychology isn't involved in presenting something to you in a particular way, and even giving you an opinion on various topics. That's the standard technique, including television as well, where after a president, for instance, speaks, they bring on about 2 experts, at least minimum 2, sometimes 4, and they'll leave you with 2 main opinions, so you can pick one or the other, like a toss-up. But really, why would you need them if you heard the guy speak himself? Why would you need 4 interpreters to tell you what the president just said? You see? So, games are played on us constantly, and it's a lifelong process. It doesn't stop, because you're under a scientific type of socialism, and big players like Bertrand Russell and Brzezinski and various other people talked about the time not only was coming, but technically was already there 40 years ago, maybe even 50, where the media and the governments behind those countries that use the media were using advertising agencies like the Bernays type deals to influence the behavior, to use the unconscious motivations of people, to direct those motivations into what the government wanted them to go into, and create the kind of society they wanted. And they've got it really. They've got it. And strangely, along with it too, there was a revolution going on at the same time, and it was authorized by these same people who wanted to keep control. Interesting, really, when you look at it, we always think of those in power as kind of static and wanting to maintain a type of system that doesn't change very much, maybe more compliant people, but not really for change. And the opposite is true. They wanted to create a different kind of society. And it isn't until you understand the sexual revolution that was promoted from the top, because these are the guys at the top promote all revolutions, for progress they call it, and see the outcomes of it. Then you understand that it's so similar to the communist ideology of the abolition of the family unit. And that's what came out of it, basically. We saw countries building mainly single-parent family homes, like Britain, massive social housing projects, because they knew in the 60s they were going to make it the way in society that eventually come the 70s and 80s, most women would be single, and the ones that were mothers would be single mothers. They had designed us as a culture to make this happen. And unfortunately, when they sit at the top there with full confidence talking about how they can manipulate us all and all our behaviors, they're quite correct in what they say. It isn't just an idle boast. They're not really boasting about it. They take it in a more passé sort of way, because they've had so many, maybe hundreds of years, maybe longer, of using these techniques on the general public. They can make you believe and do whatever they want you to believe and do. That's a sad truth. Terribly sad. And we also know too that the British Empire was to be the model state for the world, the model system, I should say, for the world to copy under the United Nations. And they certainly used that structure by placing what they called democracies, or leaving those countries they pulled out of eventually with a form of democracy, sometimes slightly altered for the cultural makeup of its people. But basically standardizing a system, that was the technique that was used. And it's still actually one of the tenets of the Royal Institute of International Affairs - Council on Foreign Relations, that they will not pull out of a country that they've taken over or invaded under any guise whatsoever. They will not pull out until they've set up a similar structure of this so-called democratic institution based on England. Now, out of that was to come the global society, but not just any global society. It was a society where a very powerful government using scientific techniques would run every individual in almost the socialistic fashion that the communists predicted would come in eventually. The communists never got quite to it. They did bring school to work in. They picked children at school. They'd give them a few tests, very young, and then they would decide there and then what those children would be educated in. And if they picked you for an engineer, you would get exactly what you needed to know to become an engineer, but nothing else. And that's how they did it. And then we find to do the same thing in the West with school to work projects and the various technical schools that were sprung up all over the place as well. So you see something that, although they appear different, a Soviet system and a Western system, they appear different through the propaganda aspects of newspapers. When you actually look at what they're doing, they're pretty well the same in structure, because they're aiming at the same ending. And of course, the general public didn't know that eventually the Soviet structure was to be blended completely with that of the West. And so you'd have something that Lenin talks about after the dictatorship would be over. He said that a system would come out that wasn't quite capitalist and not quite communist. And what they meant by that was a socialist, scientifically run society with experts running the general public, experts and governmental departments galore, of course. And he also said, too, mind you, that they'd start up services like police services, health services, educational services, which would eventually become authorities over the general public. Because these are essential to take over the minds of people. The education is incredibly essential, because education is just indoctrination, you see, to give you a view of reality and train you for your function in that society to really serve it as a taxpayer. And therefore, nothing really surprises us when the Rees Commission came out in the 1950s, examining the foundations, the big foundations in America and Europe, and to find out that they were actually pushing what seemed to be communist front groups and heavily funding them. And they were told by the CEOs of a couple of the foundations, this was a hearing, this was a congressional hearing and a senatorial hearing on these foundations. It came out from the CEOs of these foundations. Their job was to eventually merge the culture of the West with the Soviet system and their culture down the road. Well, that's happened. That's happened. And of course, it's so fascinating to watch them set up first the League of Nations and then the United Nations to help bring about this as a sort of negotiating table where they supposedly would hammer out the differences and find ways to implement these grand schemes. And of course they're doing it too. The United Nations too was to become a form of governmental body, a world governmental body or regulatory body. And it might change its name down the road when all this is accomplished, of course. And we're almost there today. Almost there. There's not a law passed in your country that really does not come from the United Nations, be it criminal or be it civil or be it to do with building codes or whatever. It all comes from departments in the United Nations and dished out to every country that signed on to them and then implemented by what you think is your own country into law. They've got a finger in every single pie. But I remember too, reading H.G. Wells, when he celebrated the setup of the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations, and he said that eventually the government will achieve what it always wanted to. He thought it was a great thing. And that was total power over every individual with no family structure standing in the way. And no wife or husband to stand in the way of party loyalty to the system. And the government could talk directly to you as an individual and order you. And that's why George Orwell in 1984, it starts off in his book where the big telly screen in his room talks directly to him. There's no one there. You're on your own. You're kind of shaking with fear. And there's Big Brother and Big Brother's front spokespeople dictating right to you, telling you what to do. We're almost there, especially with the internet. Some countries have already set up your private governmental internet connection so the government can notify you whatever directly to you and speak to you directly on your computer. And the rest will follow suit, I'm sure, very, very shortly. It's all coming very, very well. And when you go through something like a financial crisis that's supposedly, and it's so incredible, so incredibly farcical, that anybody would actually believe that no one saw this so-called explosion and bubble bursting with the economy, because they took the reins off the economy years ago. And all the watchdogs that watched over it to make sure that, that allows so much corruption to go on with trading and investments and little bubbles, but it didn't get out of hands. Well, they took all those reins off and said, well, go by this new technique which will help the market balance itself. They'll be honest, these guys. Trust us. Back with more after this break. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt. We're cutting through the matrix, just talking about the big script that we live through and how it so reminds me of, again, Orwell's portrayal of a time when a form of martial law would be used to the extreme. Incredible security under the constant threat of terrorism internally and traitors and so on, which we're going through now. We always have that in the reign of terror by our government. And he showed you that the proles, the ordinary folk, really don't count much because they don't do much. They don't do much inquiry, thinking. They're pretty powerless. They're kept out of the picture. They go along. They're really apolitical, most people. If you leave them alone, they're pretty... Once they're out of university and they get over that wild phase of their indoctrination by professors, they go back to just sitting back, having a good time. Bertrand Russell also said the same thing too, that most folk are apolitical, therefore minorities always change the future. And believe you me, in a system run by money, naturally the richest minorities are the ones who run the system. It makes quite natural sense, doesn't it? Those who have the cash run the system. And we are run by foundations. Now, to show you too the agendas that they have, I'm going to put a link tonight to the site. It's called Global Governance 2025 at a Critical Juncture, it's called. And it's put out by the International Security Society or something. It's also put up by the CIA.